Hello, my friends. Today I'm here to teach you about photosynthesis. So, as an overview of photosynthesis, it is a process by which organisms build sugars through the use of energy from the sun and atmospheric CO2. So, we know that glucose is composed of carbon-carbon. It's a string of carbons that makes the glucose molecule. When plants synthesize glucose, when they synthesize sugars, they're actually pulling those carbons from the atmosphere. So they're taking CO2 from the air and splicing them together to make sugars. To go over a little bit of terminology here when we're looking at plants. So some plants will have these things, these little pores on the underside of leaves, where you get that gas exchange. You pull in CO2 and you release the oxygen into the air. We call that little pore the stoma. Photosynthesis, so the whole process of photosynthesis, that's going to occur within your chloroplasts. And within your chloroplasts, you have these little flat pancakes called thylakoids. So your light reaction of photosynthesis is going to happen in the thylakoid membrane. And then outside of your thylakoids, you've got juice within your chloroplast, and that is called stroma. So it's important to know the difference between stroma and stoma. Stoma are the pores, and stroma is that space within the chloroplast. A stack of thylakoids, we call those grana or granum if we're speaking plurally. All right, so now if we're looking within a single thylakoid, I think this is looking within a single thylakoid, or maybe this is just... Okay, we're looking within the chloroplast here. And so the light reaction, which we'll get into the specifics of later, that's going to happen on the thylakoid membranes. And then the Calvin cycle is going to happen within the stroma, within the juice of the chloroplast. All right, so plants. Let's just talk about photoautotrophs in general, actually. So plants are photoautotrophic. So that means that they are autotrophic, meaning they make their own food, and they do so using sunlight or some kind of light to do so. So photoautotrophs. So they are self-feeding. That's what the autotroph means. And the photo meaning they use light to get there. So they don't consume organic molecules derived from other organisms. They're pulling their components from the atmosphere, or at least when we're talking about making sugars. So they make their own food in the form of sugar through the process of photosynthesis. So they use light as energy to fuel the endergonic pathway. So endergonic, we are taking smaller things and making something bigger, versus exergonic, where we're taking something bigger and breaking it down into many small pieces. So all of this is going to take place within the chloroplast, and the chloroplasts are what contribute to the green color of plants. So your chloroplasts contain a lot of chlorophyll A, actually a lot of different types of chlorophylls. The reason why they're green, well, actually we'll get to this later, but the reason why they're green is because they're absorbing all other wavelengths of light and they're reflecting green, and that's why we actually get to observe that green. So although this chapter focuses on plants, it's also important to note that other organisms such as bacteria can also photosynthesize. Okay, so when we went over cellular respiration, we started off with sugar. Remember, we had C6H12O6, and we added some oxygen into the mix, plus 6O2. And what we did was we broke down that sugar into carbon dioxide, and we also had water as a byproduct. Now, when we look at the reaction of photosynthesis, what we're doing is the inverse. We're taking 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus sunlight to make that sugar, C6H12O6, and then a byproduct that the plants will yield as a result is 6O2. Also an important note for plants, they will have both chloroplasts and mitochondria. So just because they have chloroplasts doesn't mean that they don't need something to actually utilize that sugar to get ATP from. And so, what plants will have is they'll have those chloroplasts, which will make that sugar, and then they could send that sugar over to the mitochondria to then convert that sugar into ATP, which is the main energy currency of cells. So this reaction, the process of photosynthesis, much like the cellular respiration reaction, they are both redox reactions. So what that means is something is going to be oxidized and something is going to be reduced. And so in this case, you have this 6CO2, which is spliced together. So these carbons are spliced together into this carbon-based sugar. And so this is actually becoming reduced. I know it's a little bit counterintuitive, but when you're building something, it's a general rule of thumb is that when you are making something larger from something smaller, that smaller thing is being reduced. When you are taking a larger molecule and breaking it down into smaller molecules, so here's a more diverse molecule here, 6H2O, and you're breaking it down into just pure oxygen, which is less diverse, you are therefore oxidizing H2O into O2. So if you were to look at this equation, and if I were to ask you what is being reduced and what is being oxidized, you would say your CO2 is being reduced, and you would say that your H2O is being oxidized. Also, as another general rule of thumb, if you're gaining electrons, you're becoming reduced. So you look at this 6CO2, no hydrogens, then you look at where that carbon and that oxygen ended up. Look, you've got some hydrogens here, so you're gaining electrons. Oxidation, you lose. As a general rule of thumb, you're losing hydrogens. And so you look at this 6H2O, and where does it end up? It ends up here, and you've got no more hydrogens, so therefore it was oxidized. Okay, so we've already briefly talked about the anatomy of a leaf. You've got your stoma, which are the pores of your leaves. You've got veins, so that's the vasculature. That's how your plant will transport its fluids and its sugars around within the various types of vasculature within the vein. And then we've got our stacks of thylakoid called grana, and we have our thylakoids. Okay. So let's look at the structure of chloroplasts. We're going to kind of be redundant here, but it's good for your mental health. So stroma, that's the liquid inside of the chloroplast. This is going to be the location of the Calvin cycle. So this is the light-independent cycle. And we're going to talk about what makes it light-independent later. Grana, those are going to be their stack of membrane sacs. Thylakoid membrane, that's the location of your light-dependent reactions. So these are things that are important to know. The difference between where the Calvin cycle and the light reaction are going to occur within your chloroplast. Chlorophyll A, that is just a type, one of many types of photopigments, and what this does is it absorbs photons in all wavelengths except green. So that green wavelength of light is actually reflected, and it is a very abundant, so chlorophyll A is a very abundant photopigment found in plants, and that's why the majority of plants that we see that photosynthesize are the color green. All right, so let's talk about light a little bit. We're not going to get too deep into the physics, but light generally is characterized as photons or packets of light energy, and they travel at various wavelengths, and a wavelength is just the distance between wave crests. So here would be your, here's a crest, here's a crest, here's a crest, or a crest, a peak or trough. And so you'd have shorter wavelengths here and longer wavelengths over here. Or actually, I would say one entire cycle of a wave would be its wavelength. But anyways, like I said, we're not going to get too deep into the physics. So if we're starting off with the shortest wavelengths, we've got the shortest wavelengths that we're going to talk about, we have gamma rays. So these are things that we can't necessarily see. We also can't necessarily see radio waves, and these are very long wavelengths. So the only wavelengths of light that we can see, wavelengths of energy that we could see, is this small window of visible light. And so we go from our violet colored light of 400 nanometers to our red light, which is around 740 nanometers. So visible light is between 400 and 740 nanometers. Okay, so plants are green because they have a lot of chlorophyll A, and what chlorophyll A does is it absorbs all the wavelengths of light. Our plants, our photosynthesizing plants, they want to take the sun's energy and harvest it. They want to convert that potential energy into another type of potential energy. And in doing so, they're absorbing all of the wavelengths of light. There's one wavelength of light that it doesn't necessarily use, and so it reflects it, and that's the color green. And so that's why we see green when we look at, plants. We could look at, something red, for example, like here's, the red or the orange on here. We're seeing this as red because what it's doing is it's absorbing all wavelengths of light, but the red wavelength. And so that is reflected and that reaches our retina and we're able to see it. So any colors that you see aren't necessarily that color themselves, they're reflecting that color. And I guess in that sense you could characterize it as being that color. That is the color that it reflects as it absorbs all other wavelengths. And so, as I said earlier, there's many different photopigments found in plants. You've got all kinds of other accessory pigments. So your accessory pigments will absorb other wavelengths and transfer that energy to chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is kind of like your main chlorophyll molecule, or your main photopigment is kind of the reaction center for your antenna complex, which we'll talk about later. But you've got other things like carotenoids or beta carotene, and these have an orange and yellow pigment. So what they're doing is they're absorbing all other wavelengths, including green, and they're reflecting red or orange or yellow, for example. And the reason why we get the change of color in the leaves with the change of the seasons is because what happens is as we get that transition to our colder months, the chlorophyll A begins to deteriorate, and what's left behind are the other accessory pigments such as carotenoids and beta carotene, which will give that yellow or orange or red pigment. Okay, so when we're talking about photosynthesis, it's going to happen in two steps. So first, we have something called our light reactions, where we're using light to do something. And then our second reaction, we call the Calvin cycle. This is where we're actually pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and splicing it together to make sugars. So light reaction, this is where we're using our water. We know that plants need water. That's because what they do is they harvest that water for its electrons. And then as a result, what plants do is they yield that oxygen. We generally know that plants will give off oxygen as we, consume that oxygen and ourselves give off CO2. Well, plants will take in water and break down that water into oxygen and release that into the atmosphere in their light reaction of photosynthesis. In the process of that light reaction, what they're actually doing is making some ATP. They're making some NADPH. So this is a lot like NADH in that it's an electron carrier, but the molecular structure is a little bit different, but it functions the same as in that it's a electron carrier. And so in this light reaction, they do make a little bit of ATP. They make some electrons, or they package some electrons into their electron carriers, and they use that ATP to create the larger molecule from smaller molecules. In the I think it was in the energy lecture, I talked briefly about endergonic and exergonic reactions. Typically, when we want to build something large from many small pieces, it's going to take energy. Kind of like even maintaining the order of your room, it actually takes energy. It's an endergonic process. You contribute energy to create order to build something bigger. And because the process of taking CO2, splicing together those smaller molecules into a larger molecule, it is endergonic, therefore it takes energy, and that's why the light reaction kind of exists to potentiate this Calvin cycle. So Calvin cycle is building sugars from smaller things, and your light reaction is just getting just enough energy and electrons to feed into this Calvin cycle so that they can make those sugars from smaller things. So here's a little bit of redundancy here. We've got our CO2 plus our water. This is what plants need. So they need CO2 from the atmosphere, they need water from wherever they get water, and they also need sunlight. And the end result is they make some glucose, they make some sugars, and they release oxygen into the atmosphere. So here we have, light, which hits your chloroplasts, and you get this light reaction where you're taking H2O, yielding O2, harvesting those electrons in the form of NADPH, also making some ATP. You feed that into Calvin's cycle, which utilizes ATP and NADPH to make ADP and NADP+, and they're taking in CO2 from the atmosphere and making sugar. All right, so let's deep dive into it now. So stage 1, your light independent reactions, or your light dependent reactions. That's going to happen on your thylakoid membrane. So this happens in the thylakoid membranes. Light is absorbed, ATP is generated, NADPH is generated. And then your stage 2, your Calvin cycle, that's going to happen in the stroma of the chloroplast. So within the juice of the chloroplast. It does not use light, so it's light independent. And it uses that ATP and it uses that NADPH that you've created in your light reactions. And it's also going to take in CO2 from the atmosphere. So when we're looking at the light reactions, it's going to happen in a place called a photosystem. So all photopigments, the antenna complex, so you could call this light harvesting complex here, you can kind of call that like an antenna complex. So what it is it's kind of an antenna to bring in signal, and in this case it's bringing in light, and it's funneling that energy into your reaction center, which is your chlorophyll A. So your chlorophyll A it's chlorophyll A, and what happens when it becomes excited is it gives off an electron, a single electron. Okay, so all photopigments, the antenna complex on the thylakoid membrane, direct light energy to chlorophyll A molecule, the reaction center, which then gets excited. So you excite that electron, and that electron then moves, so that electron bounces from chlorophyll A to a primary electron acceptor. So kind of think of the electron transport chain where you have proteins which will move an electron from protein to protein to protein to protein. So here we don't have to remember all of these acronyms. This is a pretty colorful and lively picture, but I'll be specific for what I want you to know. So your photosystem. We just saw an example of a photosystem here. It consists of your antenna complex, your reaction center. Okay, so antenna complex gathers the light, sends that energy to your reaction center or chlorophyll A. That chlorophyll A yields an electron. Now that chlorophyll A is missing an electron. So how is that chloroplast going to refill the electron, or refill chlorophyll A's electron slot? What happens is your chloroplast is going to break down water. So it's going to take that water and break it into oxygen and hydrogen. And in the process of doing that, it's stripping that electron. And so it feeds that electron back into the reaction center. So it kind of refills that bullet. And so now it could be potentiated again by the antenna complex. So that electron is going to bounce from protein to protein to protein. And in the process, kind of like when we talked about the electron transport chain in cellular respiration, what's going to happen is it's going to move hydrogens from the stroma of the chloroplast into the thylakoid lumen. So into that little pancake, the pocket that pancake is around. So water is split into oxygen gas and hydrogen ions and excited electrons. So that excited electron moves from protein to protein to protein. And then ATP is made from ADP using free phosphate, protons, and ATPase proton pump. Okay, so remember in cell respiration, we had something called ATP synthase, which used the hydrogen gradient within the intermembrane space to move hydrogen through and make ATP kind of as a result. as kind of like I think the analogy that I used was kind of like a dam. So, you know, you have running water, we're letting the water move to where it needs to go, but in the process, we're going to convert some of that potential energy into another form of potential energy. And so you've got an electron that moves from protein to protein to protein to protein. You're creating a hydrogen gradient, high acidic environment within the thylakoid lumen. And remember, all of these hydrogens want to move outside into the stroma of the chloroplast. And so what happens is ATP synthase allows that to happen, and in the process, it converts ADP into ATP. So now you've got some ATP there. So photosystem 2, and this is another thing that may be helpful in the future if any of you guys go into botany. Photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 are actually kind of mismatched in their chronology. Photosystem 1 was discovered first, but it actually comes second. Photosystem 2 was discovered second, but it actually comes first. And so we dealt with photosystem 2. Remember that electron moved. Then it's eventually dropped off to photosystem 1. So photosystem 1, we can look at this again. You know, you have this electron that moves from chlorophyll A when it's excited by, you know, the energy funneled in through your antenna complex, and it moves to a primary electron acceptor, and it moves from protein to protein to protein to protein to protein. If this was photosystem 2, its electron would be replenished by water. That electron would come from water. However, when we're talking about photosystem 1, we're not breaking down water here. It's actually receiving its electron from photosystem 2. So that same electron that was initially bumped off moved to photosystem 1 from photosystem 2. So if I were to ask you a question, where does photosystem 2 get its electrons from? You'd say water. Then if I were to ask a question, where does photosystem 1 get its electrons from? You'd say photosystem 2. Okay. That was kind of, that was long. We'll probably go over it again. So an electron carrier, NADPH, takes the electron excitement to the Calvin cycle. That is something that I forgot to mention. So when we did look at the electron transport chain of cellular respiration, we know that oxygen was the final electron acceptor in cellular respiration. However, during photosynthesis, the final electron acceptor, and this is really efficient, is NADP+. So kind of like, you know, an electron acceptor is the final electron acceptor. So what happens is their, you know, ending product is NADPH. So here's the redundancy that I was talking about. So photosystem 2, you've got your antenna complex taking in that light, funneling all of that energy into your reaction center, or chlorophyll A. It kicks off an electron. That electron gets excited, and it moves from protein to protein to protein to protein to protein, and in the process, it's pumping hydrogens into this lumen of that thylakoid sac. Where does this chlorophyll A replenish its electrons? Well, you break down water into oxygen and hydrogen, and that electron, it replenishes. So we strip water of its electrons, feed that back into photosystem 2. Meanwhile, that electron moves through this electron transport chain from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. And so this light hits the antenna complex of photosystem 1. It excites chlorophyll A, much like in photosystem 2. It yields its electron. That electron moves from protein to protein. And then the final electron acceptor is NADP+, which makes NADPH. Meanwhile, where is this chlorophyll A on photosystem 1 getting its electrons from? The electron that was kicked off from photosystem 2. Electron, 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 electron. So it just moved over to photosystem 1. And then meanwhile, simultaneous to this, your ATP synthase is just sitting there harvesting this hydrogen gradient. You have all of these hydrogen ions in this thylakoid interior, and it allows those hydrogens to move through, and in the process, it converts ADP into ATP. Okay. Okay, so here's the summary. You've got carbon dioxide, or CO2, you have water, and you have sunlight. And through carbon dioxide, we know that carbon dioxide is used in the Calvin cycle. We know that water is used in the light reactions. We know that sunlight is used in the light reactions. And all of that funnels into glucose, to make glucose, and then oxygen is the byproduct. So if I were to ask a question, what are the intermediate products of photosynthesis that we would use, or what are the intermediate products of the light reaction that we would use in the Calvin cycle? You would say NADPH and ATP. So remember, the goal of photosynthesis isn't to make ATP and NADPH. We're making this as intermediate products to feed into Calvin cycle. We haven't gotten into Calvin cycle yet, but this is the endergonic process that needs energy and electrons to drive forward. So we just talked about the first half, the light reactions. Okay, so yeah, the overall goal is to make sugar. So let's jump into the Calvin cycle. And we don't have to remember all of the various terms here. This is kind of dense in terms, but we do want to know generally what happens. Okay, so carbon dioxide. That's the main thing that we're going to feed into this process. So carbon dioxide is the, you could say the rate limiting molecule of this whole reaction. And you could even say rubisco. So rubisco, this is an exception to the rule. I remember I said anything that ends in A's is an enzyme. Well, rubisco is an example of an enzyme. So this is an enzyme and it doesn't end in A's. But this is the rate limiting enzyme. This catalyzes the first step of your Calvin cycle of photosynthesis. And so you take this CO2, and what rubisco does is it splices your CO2 together to make this molecule called 3-phosphoglycerate. And so now with the Calvin cycle, like I said, we don't need to remember all of these different terms, but you go from 3-phosphoglycerate to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, and look at what you're doing here. You're adding ATP to the mix. So 6 ATP to 6 ADP. And what are you doing? You're using up that NADPH, and you're synthesizing, or you're left with NADP plus as you infuse those electrons into this molecule. So then you're left with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and then you move on through a cycle. Some of it branches off, so some of it's used to make sugar. So this is going to be used to make glucose and other sugars, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and then some of it's just brought back into the cycle. You're left with ribulose bisphosphate, and that's spliced together with your CO2 to make this. But also look here, so you're adding more ATP into the mix, so it looks like you've expended a total of 9 ATP to make a little bit of glucose. You've expended, 6 NADPH to make a little bit of glucose. So very energy intensive process that takes a lot of energy. So yes, it uses NADPH and ATP from the light reaction. So first you've got carbon fixation, so it combines with ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. The enzyme, so the one thing that I do want you to remember is rubisco. And actually, if you think about it, we've got more producers on Earth than we have consumers. So it only makes sense that we would have more photosynthesizing organisms than we have things that consume those things, that consume sugars from those photosynthesizers. So it's hypothesized that rubisco is actually the most common protein on Earth. It's the most commonly found protein on Earth. The most abundant protein on Earth is rubisco. Okay, so Calvin cycle. So after we've done the carbon fixation, next we have making sugars. So using ATP and NADPH to add hydrogens and move molecules around to make glucose. So now we're making sugars. And then the third step, or the third process, is reforming that starting product. So, and this is also going to use ATP. Okay. So here we're just reviewing this is just the Calvin cycle summary. So we took CO2 from the atmosphere, we took ATP, and we took NADPH from the light reaction, and then as a result we made glucose, which was the end goal. So the overall process of photosynthesis is 6 CO2 plus H2O plus sunlight to make C6H12O6, or glucose or sugar, plus 6O2. So what was reduced? your CO2, what was oxidized, your H2O. Okay, and so this is just an overview for you guys to look at. These sugars could be anything. They could just be, so these sugars could be used in cellular respiration. Those sugars could be used to make cellulose, to make starch for storage, or other organic compounds. So photosynthesizers don't only use sugars for energy. They can use it for many other things. So they have many uses for sugars. And then here's another review. These are both overviews to kind of help you guys work through the process. Remember, you don't have to know all the names of these guys. Just know Rubisco, know what is used where, and where we're getting that stuff. Where are we getting this ATP? We're getting this from the light reaction. Where are we getting this NADPH? We're getting it from the light reaction. Where is the Calvin cycle happening? It's happening in the stroma. Where is the light reaction happening? It's happening in the thylakoid membrane. Where does photosystem 1 get its electron from? H2O. What does photosystem 2 get its electron from? H2O. Where does photosystem 1 get its electron from? From photosystem 2. What does your light reaction require? It requires water. It requires light. Okay. So now let's talk about more of the macro stuff. So how do plants breathe? They've got these things called stomates, or openings found at the underside of leaves. So those are their pores, not stroma, but stoma, or stomates. And so what they're doing is they're pulling CO2 in and they're letting oxygen out. Now, one thing that plants will struggle with is losing water. They don't want to lose water. They need water for their photosynthesis, for their light reaction of their photosynthesis. And so that's a big problem with many plants. However, if you live in a temperate environment, if you're a plant and you live in a temperate environment, it's not so much of an issue. However, if you're living in the middle of the desert, it might be more of an issue because it's hotter, brighter, and you might get more evaporation, water loss, when you open up those stomates. So we have some different types of plants. Most of the plants that we know of are C3 plants. And C3 plants, what they do is they open up their stomates during the day because it's not so hot that they become dehydrated. So they open up their stomates during the day, and they're also going to do, their CO2 fixation and close them at night because, they'll close them at night because they're not necessarily conducting the light reaction. Remember, the light reaction is using water, releasing oxygen. They need to get rid of that oxygen as well, but they don't want to get rid of the water. Yeah, and so they'll close them at night to reduce transpiration. If they're not conducting their light reaction of photosynthesis, then what's the point of having their stomates open where they could potentially get evaporation or transpiration or water loss? So those are C3 plants. So those are going to be things like your tomatoes, most flowering things that we see outside. Those are all going to be C3 plants. Now, secondly, we have something called C4 plants. So these plants, like C3 plants, they'll open up their stomates during the day and they'll close them at night, like our C3 plants, but they have a more efficient photosynthesis rate because what they do is when they have their stomates open and they're taking in CO2 and releasing their oxygen, what they're doing is they're actually fixing that CO2. So it's not just this transient gas that moves in and out of the cell and potentially waste it. What they do is they trap that CO2 and they'll do their Calvin cycle during the night as well, whereas our C3 plants will not typically. Now lastly, we have our desert plants. So our C4 plants would be things like your corn and your pineapple. Now your desert plants, what they do is they open up their stomates at night and they close them during the day. So complete inverse of our C3 and C4 plants. And they use the same carrier, they use the same carrier molecule as C4, but they hold on to CO2 until the morning. And so they just have an inverse schedule, and we call those cam plants. So those are going to be things like your desert cacti. And so the most important thing to know here, so there's a lot of details with that, but the most important thing to know here is just know which one has the highest potential to lose water and which one has the least potential to lose water. So our CAN plants will lose the least amount of water, whereas C3 plants, they will lose more water through photorespiration than any of the other ones. And then our C4 plants are actually somewhere in the middle. Sorry, pineapple was a CAN plant. I knew it was a CAN plant. Okay. C4 plants were corn, and then most of the other plants, so your tomatoes, your cherries, those are going to be C3 plants. Okay, and so I think this is one of the last slides. Yeah, this is one of the last slides, but this is to kind of show you how both the chloroplasts and mitochondria will work together to sustain an organism. So you've got sunlight that hits your chloroplast, hits your thylakoid membrane of your chloroplast. Your photosystem 1 takes in, it releases its electron, bounces through that electron transport chain to photosystem 2. In the process, you're making that ATP. Let's just say you're making that ATP, you're making that NADPH within your light reaction. So remember, you need sunlight, you're making ATP, you're making NADPH. And what you're doing is you're also releasing oxygen. Remember, you're breaking down water to release oxygen. So you're releasing some oxygen, and then you feed that ATP and NADPH into the Calvin cycle. That Calvin cycle uses that energy, those electrons to make glucose, and they're also taking in CO2 in the process. So now let's say your plant also needs energy currency to do stuff, to conduct cellular processes. Well, you're going to send that glucose over into the cytoplasm of the cell, and that's going to be broken down through glycolysis. Just like when we were talking about cellular respiration, that glucose sent into the cytoplasm, broken down into pyruvate. That pyruvate is sent into the mitochondria, the matrix of the mitochondria, and it's gonna undergo pyruvate oxidation, and then the acetyl-CoA is going to be fed into the Krebs cycle, and then the Krebs cycle churns out ATP and NADH. And so you've got ATP and NADH and also FADH2. And what is one of the byproducts of the Krebs cycle? You yield the most CO2 from the Krebs cycle than any other process in cellular respiration. And what can you do with that CO2? You can use that in the Calvin cycle. So you've got this crosstalk between your mitochondria and your chloroplast. So you feed that CO2 back into your chloroplast. Hey, we don't need the CO2. And hey, chloroplast, you can fix that into something. In the meantime, your electron transport chain is churning about, making your ATP that you need. One of the other byproducts are heat. And another byproduct is, remember, what's the last electron acceptor in the electron transport chain? Oxygen. Remember what produces oxygen? Your chloroplast. Chloroplast produces oxygen. Electron transport chain uses oxygen as the final electron acceptor. You create water. You can send that water to your chloroplast. And what do you need in the light reaction of photosynthesis? You need water. And so these two organelles are perfectly coupled to make plants very efficient, or just photosynthesizers, very efficient organisms. So here's just comparing and contrasting the differences between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So they're both redox reactions. Remember, in cellular respiration, sugar is oxidized, and remember, in photosynthesis, your CO2 is reduced to yield sugars. So sugar is oxidized into CO2 in cell respiration, and then in photosynthesis, CO2 is reduced to make sugars. And then in cell respiration, oxygen becomes reduced to make water, and then in photosynthesis, water is oxidized to yield oxygen, or O2. And so here is just showing the equations. So this becomes oxidized, your glucose becomes oxidized in cell respiration into CO2, and in cell respiration, your oxygen becomes reduced into H2O. Remember, it's the final electron acceptor of your electron transport chain of cell respiration in the mitochondria. So in cell respiration, energy is released, stored as ATP, and then in photosynthesis, energy is required. Remember, it's endergonic, and so energy is used to create another type of potential energy. So a few other things here is the global carbon cycle. And so generally the carbon cycle works like this. So you've got your photosynthesizers, which what they do is take in CO2 from the environment. And actually, your phytoplankton in the oceans, this is something we'll get into in the very final section of the class, but the highest producers on Earth, the highest percentage of oxygen contribution on Earth comes from our oceans. Usually we think that most of our oxygen on Earth comes from the tropical rainforest, with all, we have all these organisms, all these plants, all these photosynthesizers there, but actually your phytoplankton in your oceans have produced more than your tropical rainforests, and they cover more surface of the Earth as well. So, and we'll talk about that in the final section. So you've got your photosynthesizers taking in CO2 from the atmosphere, and then we have organisms like ourselves, heterotrophs, which eat stuff. They take in oxygen from the environment, and we produce CO2. So at some point, everything was kind of in a nice, pretty synchrony before the Industrial Revolution, or even, you could even say before that. And you had this give and take where we breathe out CO2, and your photosynthesizers take in the CO2 and give out oxygen. But now with the introduction of burning fossil fuels, we've kind of offset that whole balance. So the cycling of carbon from the air to the organisms back into the air. So the carbon cycle is just explaining how carbon is transferred from organism to organism, or from area to area. And so you got CO2 to sugars through photosynthesis, so that's carbon fixing. And then through us, we conduct a lot of cellular respiration. We take those sugars and we break them into CO2 and release that into the environment. And so I think this is the final bit of terminology here. So the greenhouse effect. So things like CO2, methane, and greenhouse gases, what they do is they trap heat radiated from Earth. This is called the greenhouse effect. So, usually what happens is you get heat radiation from the sun, which will hit the Earth. And normally what happens is that once it hits the Earth, it may be absorbed by some things, but it will bounce off of the Earth and off into space. So normally it is reflected from Earth and bounces off into space. Some of the heat is contained, and most of it, the majority of it, dissipates into space. However, when we have a lot of CO2 or greenhouse gases, which cloud up our atmosphere, what happens is instead of bouncing off of the Earth and moving off into space, what happens is it actually hits those greenhouse gases and moves back to Earth, and then moves back out to potentially move out into space, but it's interfered by the greenhouse gases and it moves back, and it stays on Earth for longer, which causes greater heat, or greater heat retention. So burning fossil fuels creates more greenhouse gases, which results in global climate change. So if I were to ask you a question, I'll likely ask you a question having you tell the difference between the greenhouse effect and global climate change. So global climate change that describes the climate changing. The greenhouse effect is simply the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which would cause climate change. So greenhouse effect would cause climate change. Okay, so that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.